Hi everyone, it's John. Welcome back to my channel. So, in case you didn't catch the first part of the last video that I posted, for what I anticipated to be a large part of the spring of 2024, which corresponds roughly with an event I'm participating in called Historathon, where we read history all year long, I wanted to read about the Vikings. I only got 2 books into the Vikings before I got distracted by other things, which I'll also eventually review. But I wanted to talk about the second book that I read about them. The last video was the first one. This is the second one. So, unfortunately, the Vikings still kind of have a stranglehold on our imagination. There's a lot to learn about them, but there's also a lot to unlearn about them. Yes, they pillaged and looted and enslaved people, like I mentioned in the last video, but why? To what end? Since the Vikings weren't literate in the sense of having a kind of a workaday, everyday alphabet, they did have runes that were mostly limited to things like magic and religion, the commemoration of ancestors, and things like that. Most of the hows and whys of Viking history come down to us only from the Christians who wrote about them centuries after the fact. Consequently, any kind of history someone writes, social, cultural, literary, whatever, will lean heavily into archaeology almost out of necessity. And that's what I said Neil Price's book, The Children of Ash and Elm, does. This book, which is The Age of Vikings by Anders Winroth, which comes out from the vaunted Princeton University Press, of course, opens with a scene characteristic of the way Anders Winroth writes the rest of the book, sort of setting a scene and building a narrative interest for a casual reader. He talks about a skald, who is an Old Norse poet, reading at the hall of a jarl, which is sort of the Nordic version of an earl. And these little vignettes that he inserts throughout the book make it ideal for engaging the attention of someone who is new to the subject and doesn't know a lot about it. To introduce Viking migration and expansion, he discusses the diverging paths of 2 men named Rorik. One who became an important leader in Holland, while the other traveled all over Europe. The chapter about life on a farm, for example, opens with the story of a woman named Estrid, whose husband died on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The 2 dates that sandwich the sort of so-called Viking Age are its sudden arrival in 793 with the attack on the Lindisfarne monastery, and on the other end, 1066, when Harold Hardrada takes an arrow to the neck at Stamford Bridge, and sort of the Vikings sort of not overnight come to an end, but quickly lose a lot of their power and relevance in Northern Europe. This book is just about 250 pages long, but it touches on nearly every topic you could hope to read about in a popular history on the Vikings. The place of violence in Viking culture, how the Vikings emerged as a people at the end of the Age of Migration, their settlements throughout Scandinavia, and their slow movement toward Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, and even Vinland later on. The construction of longships, and Viking paganism and the religious syncretism it formed with as they slowly turned into Christians. And it ends with a really interesting discussion of skaldic poetry, runes, and the visual arts the Vikings had. And as with any book on the subject, the chapters are organized topically instead of chronologically. It's really hard to do this chronologically because it's such a what we know about Vikings is kind of piecemeal. So let me see if I can do a close up. Is that any better? Sorry, it's very, very smudged on my end. But violence in a violent time. Ships, boats, and ferries to the afterworld. Coins, silk, and herring. Viking Age trade from kings to from chieftains to kings. So again, chapters that are short, approachable, and you can tell what the chapter is going to be about from the chapter name, which I appreciate because if I'm going back to reference some information, of course you can always head towards the back, but chapter titles that are not deliberately ambiguous or poetic are appreciated. So in a book so short, things have to be left out, right? This isn't a compendium of Norse myths or a distillation of the Eddas, but you can't find books like that. While there's some detail about the interactions with the people Vikings encountered, like the Franks, the Frisians, the Rus, there isn't exactly as much as I would have liked about the raiding of Viking monasteries, which is a lot of people how a lot of people learn about the Vikings in the first place, along the British Isles, like at the Lindisfarne Monastery and at Jarrow, the very same monastery that the Venerable Bede lived in just a couple of generations before the attack. The monkish chronicles that were written by survivors made it sound like the raids were portents of the apocalypse, so they must have been unimaginably terrifying and violent and bloody. Though in Winroth's defense, he does cover the 843 Viking raid on Nantes in France, which sounds every bit as chilling. Winroth uses the raid on Nantes to illustrate how methodical and observant Vikings were before they attacked. It must have seemed random to the citizens of Nantes and other areas they raided, but the Vikings attacked on major Christian holidays sometimes, including in 843, specifically in the feast of St. John the Baptist, when they knew Christians would be preoccupied and the coffers in the cathedral would be full to the brim of donations and offerings. And they used that day because they observed the way that they had acted in the past, and when they were observing holidays, when they were taking days off, they used that information to their advantage. University press books are sometimes a little hit and miss when it comes to the author's ability to engage and entertain an audience. But when Anders Winroth tells you about a single person or a family or an event, and then makes pretty cautious deductions about it, or so I think as a pretty rank amateur. The book isn't based off of dry findings of people whose names have been lost to history. It's told with, I said in the last video, a kind of a flair for telling stories that's a little bit more engaging than Neil Price's book, A Children of Ash and Helm. But I think it would be perfect coupled with that book. And also another book I got to dip into and out of, but I didn't finish because, so I won't be reviewing it here because I didn't make it to the very end. It's a book by Robert Ferguson called The Vikings, A History. Along with a few books on mythology and a sprinkling of the sagas, I also read the Volsung saga earlier in the year, which I'll also be talking about eventually. All of these books combined can give you a very quick and dirty idea of what the Vikings are about. Certainly not going to claim to have anything more than a superficial knowledge, but all of those books together sort of give you a foot in the door as to what the world the literature, the statecraft was all about. So I really enjoyed this one just a little bit more. And there, of course, there's a lot of overlap with the Neil Price too. But if you're looking just for readerly engagement, and you're just trying to read one book on the subject, this is better, and also, if you're pressed for time, half as long. So there's that. I read both. I enjoyed both. But if either one of those are considerations for you, I would lean towards this one. And if you have read it or plan on reading it, let me know what you think about it. The Age of Vikings by Anders Winroth. I will see you next time with another book review. Bye, everyone.